And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and in recent years, we've seen no end to conservative efforts to demonize recipients of Social Security, including recipients of Social Security disability insurance. But even that is part of a larger economic story. And here to help us unpack that now is Dean Baker. He is the co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He is an economist, the author of numerous books on that topic, and he's also co-author of a new paper entitled Rising Disability Payments: Are Cuts to Workers' Compensation Part of the Story? Dean, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's sort of end the suspense here and say, I'm guessing the answer is yes. Cuts to workers' compensation are part of the story. Tell us, if you would, a little bit about what you found in looking into this.
Yeah, and you're right. The answer is yes. Just as backdrop, there is, widely recognized increase in the numbers, I should say the percentage of the population getting disability over the last quarter century. Most of this isn't any surprise. I mean, it was projected well in advance. The basic story here is that the baby boomers are in their prime disability years. People tend to be disabled in their 50s, their 60s, not in their 20s and 30s. And the baby boomers are now in their 50s and 60s. So they're in their prime years where they're most likely to be disabled. There's some other factors because of the increase in women's participation. Women are much more likely to qualify for disability. You have to have a work history that allows you to get it. So that was known, again, predicted. Also, we've raised the Social Security retirement age. You have to be 66 to get full benefits. That means if you've been getting disability, it used to be the case when you turned 65, you switched over to retirement benefits. Now you don't switch over to retirement benefits till 66. A last factor that is really underappreciated, there's been a big decline in mortality rates for people on disability. They're still much higher than the population as a whole. So over a 10-year period, currently roughly about 20% of people getting disability will die. I mean, this is one of the factors when people mock, people on disability. Well, they're dying at pretty high rates. It used to be 40%. So people are living longer. That's a good thing. But on the other hand, that does mean the costs have risen. So these things have all been well documented, and I don't think any serious person would dispute them. But what we were looking at in this paper was a decline in the number of people getting workers' compensation. Workers' compensation is supposed to be for people suffering from on-the-job injuries. So someone's in a factory and they injure their hand, they lose their hand, prevents them from working. So workers' compensation is supposed to cover that person, give them both income until they recover from their injury, if they do recover, and also cover their medical expenses. Now, in the last 2 decades, there's been a big cutback in state-level worker compensation programs, part of the same drive we see everywhere, that, we have all these people that are playing games, they're not really hurt, we have to be tough with them. Well, apart from whether they're playing games, not really hurt, the point is that if someone's injured on the job, they apply for workers' comp, they don't get that, they're more likely to go to disability. And that's exactly what we were looking at. So we were looking at the national level, you find a very clear correlation between the reduction in the number of people getting workers' compensation and the growth in people getting disability. But we took a look at that more closely to see at the state level, do we find that same relationship? So it's not just by chance, So in states where there's a larger cut in the number of people getting workers' compensation, we see more of an increase in the number of people on the disability rolls. And that's what we found. We found pretty solid evidence. We're calling it preliminary because we want to do more research on it. But we found pretty solid evidence of this relationship, and by our analysis, that could explain roughly 1/5 of the growth in disability over the last decade.
With some of the other factors that you mentioned earlier explaining most of the rest of it?
Probably all the rest of it. So,
and this is why, Dean, if I can just jump in for a second, we're talking with the economist Dean Baker. One reason why I say that is you mentioned earlier that no serious person can dispute these other causal factors for the increase, but the fact is that some people I would characterize as unserious are very loudly disputing that and are suggesting instead, as your paper mentions in passing, that somehow this is because people don't want to work, they're lazy, they see this as an easy out instead of working for a living. So I think it's very important. One of the several reasons why contextually I think this finding is significant.
Exactly, and that was much of our motivation for looking at this because, again, disability, just to give a little more context, the disability fund is separate from the old age and retirement portion of the Social Security program. They have distinct funds. We often talk about them together, but legally they are distinct funds. And the disability portion is projected to face a shortfall sometime next year. So you have many people in the public debate, many people in Congress who are saying, well, we have to cut back the benefits. People just have a backache and they don't feel like working. And that was the context we wanted to look at this. So again, everyone knows we have, the baby boomers in their peak disability years. They know about women entering the labor force. These things aren't really arguable. But we're also seeing, well, as part of this story that people used to get workers' comp aren't getting it, so now they're getting disability. And our analysis shows, that's a big part of the picture. So there doesn't seem to be much room left for this idea that people suddenly have gotten lazy, that, people used to, we all have backaches, we all have, everyone has that. So that's, we understand that. You go to work with that. But the point is that for the most part, when we talk about people with disabilities, or people who have very serious, physical, mental problems that make it difficult, if not impossible, to work.
It's actually very difficult if you read the process of in terms of applying for disability and achieving it, obtaining it. It's not easy to do. It's not something that, Rand Paul says, well, everybody's back hurts a little. This is not what that's about. It's a fairly rigorous process. But I guess what I would add to that would be this, that another way to look at this in a broader context, and you allude to this in your paper, is that what we're really seeing here, while the Republicans are making political hay out of this issue, is that the workers' compensation system is by and large funded by privately by employers and insurers. So to the extent that people are forced off that system by rule changes or anything else, that is a transfer of what should be, in my opinion, a private expenditure to the public sector, which is then beaten up because it's having to expend more. Is that a fair statement, you think?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let me just add a little data point about the disability program, because you're saying how it is hard to get on benefits. Roughly 60%, I don't have the most recent data at my fingertips, but roughly 60% of the people who apply are initially turned down, and even after appeal, fewer than half are accepted. So they're pretty strict, so you don't go in there and go, oh, I have a backache, and they go, okay, you get disability. That's not going to be the case, which, again, is not to say, because I don't know, all the time you hear someone say, oh, well, I know so-and-so. It's a program with 10 million people on it. Some of them shouldn't be there. But clearly, that's not the vast majority. So that, just to put that in some context. Now, the point about workers' comp that you're making, it's exactly right. The program is designed to make employers bear the responsibility of having an unsafe workplace. So if I have an unsafe workplace and I have a lot of workers that are losing limbs and unable to work, we want the employer to pay the cost of that. We don't want the general public to do that, because the employer should have a safer workplace. But if I can get out of paying that, if I could just go, oh, no, I don't feel like paying that, we'll just shift that to disability, well, then I have very little incentive to try and have a safe workplace. So that was the design of the workers' compensation program. They're experience rated, so companies that have a lot of people ending up on workers' comp pay higher premiums. And if we lose that, then in effect we don't have this incentive for companies, and they're able to put the cost of their unsafe workplace on the public as a whole.
Yeah, and Dean Baker, I don't know if you know this, by the way, but there's no reason why you would, but I worked for a number of years in the workers' compensation world as risk management, financial analyst, manager and so on. So
you should be explaining this to me then.
Well, no. You're getting it very right. But one thing that I think is important for people to realize just historically is that the workers' compensation system was created and intended to be kind of a fair bargain between employers and employees, that said the employees agree not to sue or pursue those types of remedies in return for the employers promising to keep them whole payroll if they were in fact injured on the job. And then, as you say, the incentive was supposed to be the employers can't afford to run an unsafe workplace, so they will bear the brunt of that cost, and therefore that will give them an incentive to correct. So instead, what we've got is a system where they're transferring costs to the public sector. And I guess the question is, what's next? First of all, what's next in terms of your own investigation? These are preliminary findings, but they seem compelling. So your next step is going to be to nail them down, or more?
Yeah, I mean, we had to construct a data set for states, the number of people on workers' comp. I mean, a lot of data is readily available. We could just click on the website and get the data, number of people getting disability state by state. We don't have that for workers' comp, so we put a lot of effort into that. We want to look at this more closely, looking at industry employment. You tend to, not surprisingly, you tend to find workers' compensation claims disproportionately in manufacturing, some other sectors. So we want to try and control for that, which we didn't do in this initial analysis, because basically we thought the results were striking and worth getting out there. But we really do want to do a more careful analysis.
Well, I think that would be interesting and important. And while we're on this topic, by the way, of workers' compensation, I don't imagine that you looked at the benefit side or the compensation side at all, or much. But it is not a generous program. I think that's something else that people may read this and say, "Well, but maybe workers' compensation was too generous to working people." I think if you look at things like the schedule of payment in certain states for a lost arm or a lost leg, a lot of people would be shocked at how little is offered, or wage replacement that only goes up to a very low level of income. So if someone's been helping to provide for a family and then becomes disabled and gets workers' compensation, they're not well off.
No, that's right. And, the same is true of disability, which is, again, why the argument that, we have all these people who suddenly didn't feel like working and they're just going to live on disability really doesn't make a lot of sense. The average disability payment's roughly $15,000 a year. So, the idea that people are going to, quit a job and go, "Oh, my back hurts," and get disability so they could live on $15,000 a year just really doesn't make a lot of sense. And, again, workers' comp varies state by state, but I don't think there's anywhere where you'll see average benefits much above that. So, if you're at a job earning $40,000, $50,000 a year, kind of a middle class pay, the idea is somehow you're going to get by on something like $15,000. Obviously, if you're disabled, if you're injured on the job, that's much better than nothing. But that's not what any of us would consider a good standard of living.
A last question on this, Dean Baker, if we would, and I don't know if you'll know the answer, but we do see that the disability insurance program faces a shortfall next year, which the Republicans, I would say, are exploiting, in my opinion, for political purposes. But I wonder how much smaller that shortfall might be if this offloading of private sector costs into the disability system weren't taking place.
Well, it's interesting. The shortfall is relatively small in terms of total wages. I should have it at my fingertips, but it's probably around 3 or 4% of total wages. So just to take a very, very rough guess, you'd probably cut that by around a third if we hadn't had this increase in, or I should say increase in disability rolls due to the cut in workers' comp. And also in terms of the timing, we'd probably buy ourselves, if we hadn't had this, we'd probably be buying ourselves at least into 2018, 2019 until we faced a shortfall.
Yeah, see, it's interesting how these kinds of issues never seem to come up for ideological reasons. Well, really important work. I'm really glad you're on this. Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot for having me on.